All right. Well, I think we can get started here. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited about this topic here on email newsletters. I see some familiar names here. I know some of you I've met through our email newsletter. So really excited to talk about this topic. Uh, I'm Christian Benak, obviously. I also have Janet Vinci, my VP of Client Services as well. So Janet will be fielding the polls we have that we'll do throughout this. If there are any questions, feel free to put it into chat right away. Janet will be managing that. Some of the questions maybe she'll jump in and we can address during the presentation, or maybe we hold it back to the end for the Q&A. It kind of depends how it goes. So we'd love to try to make this as collaborative as possible. So with that said, I think we can move ahead and get started with things. So we want to kick off right away with a poll. So Janet, if you could launch that, but would love to get a sense of the people that are on the webinar here, if your firm has an active email newsletter. So we have, yes, you have one. No, you don't. No, but we're interested in starting one. So love to hit that. And then we'll kind of come back to the results as we go through this here. So there's really 5 objectives that I want everybody to walk away from this webinar with. The first is understanding and harnessing the power of an email newsletter. The second is distinguishing between what we call a traditional company newsletter and a thought leadership newsletter. The third is building a list of ideal clients for your newsletter. The fourth is how to publish consistently, even with a minimal budget. And the fifth is how to generate leads and win new business with your newsletter. So we're going to cover all these topics throughout the presentation today. So a little bit about us before we get in. I do know that there's quite a few faces and names that I recognize, but I know there's a lot that I don't. So a little bit about us. We are a business development and growth consulting firm, and we help agencies and consultancies land 6- and 7-figure opportunities with companies that are typically large at enterprise type organizations. So the problems that we solve for our clients are really helping them build awareness and demand, bypassing RFPs, generating leads, going up market or going enterprise, and planning for their growth. So a little bit about me before we get into it. Obviously, I'm the founder of the organization, and my background with email newsletters actually goes back almost 25 years. I started a business which would eventually become a concert promotions and experiential marketing agency, and I would grow it to be over $10 million in business. But I started off doing local banquet halls, and that's me dressed in a Tony Manero Saturday Night Live or Saturday Night Fever type outfit. So super embarrassing. So you can all laugh, but the company grew pretty rapidly, and we started working with Grammy Award-winning artists like Lady Gaga and Pitbull. And our events went from these local banquet halls to large scale concert venues with artists that I'm sure you all recognize. And not long after we started the events, we also branched off and started doing experiential marketing for companies like Disney and Toyota. And and one of the main ways we were driving concert ticket sales were through our email newsletters. And this was, 25 years ago, late 90s, early 2000s, when not everybody even had an email address at the time. And we were really one of the first that were really leveraging email. And it was a very different world where people would come to me and really beg, how do we get on your email list, Christian? We really want to know about all the cool events. Versus now, I think we're all, maybe inundated with emails. So it's a different time, but it doesn't mean that email isn't still very effective. So a little bit more about the background. So the business was booming, as I'd mentioned, and then the Great Recession hit in 2008. Things screeched to a halt. And like many agencies, I had grown through word of mouth and referrals. So I had gone out and hired a sales consultant who came in and really taught me the fundamentals of business development. And I felt invigorated and decided it was time for a change for me. So I sold off many of the assets of my business and went to go work in the agency world. And for about 10 years, I worked for independent agencies, holding company agencies, across marketing disciplines, and really discovered that my superpower was, hunting, generating leads, building awareness, specifically around these large and enterprise organizations, and was fortunate enough to be a part of, multi-million-dollar wins with, companies like Kohl's and Constellation Brands. But over those 10 years, I still felt that entrepreneurial itch, and I wanted to, get back at being an entrepreneur, but I wasn't really sure what, when, or how. And fast forward now, we're talking 2020, it's the pandemic, and agencies were losing business, budgets were drying up, some agents were even going out of business. And I felt like I could give back now. Just like that consultant helped me, 10 years prior, I felt like I was in a position that I could help others. So I was working at an agent at the time. I went to them and pitched a plan that, what would they consider changing my employment status from being a full-time employee to actually becoming a client if I were to form this company. And they said that would be great, and they agreed to that. But there was this 3-month window that I was still employed with them, but I knew I was going to be starting my company with them as a client in 3 months later. So I wanted to get my name out there and build some awareness up. So when I did switch over to my new business, this business, I would already have some potential leads. So on the nights and weekends, I decided I was going to put together an email newsletter. I went back to what was so successful for me back in the concert promotion days. And because I was employed there, I couldn't sell anything in the newsletter. I couldn't really talk about services. It was really just me. I'll show you here an example of what this first newsletter was. It was the first iteration of what was the Monday Motivation newsletter, which I know some of you on here are subscribers to. And I basically wrote a little Monday motivation story, something personal. I had a quote, I had a clever ad, and I would list out some new business leads, some CMO, appointments. And I fully expected at the end of the 3 months when I was, officially starting my business, that I would switch the newsletter and be more, promotional, salesy, talk about my services. But a funny thing happened. From the first email that went out, I was getting emails back from people saying how much they enjoyed the newsletter, value that they got from it, that they wanted to learn more. What do you actually do? And I ended up, generating a couple of really solid leads that ended up becoming clients when I eventually made the switch. And when I ended up making the switch, I saw such a value in the newsletter. I was doing it in its current form that I decided I was not going to do anything promotional. I wasn't going to do the typical company traditional newsletter. I was going to keep it more educational based. And this really started to shape like our point of view on, how an email newsletter. And it's been a huge driver of success for us. And we're going to talk a lot about that, here today. So before we get into that, do we have the results from the poll, Janet?
Yes, we can. Hold on a second. I will share. I didn't want to interrupt your flow.
Sure. So it looks like we have about 59% have a newsletter, 20% don't, and about 22% are interested. So, pretty good mix. So
Yep.
Thanks everybody for that. Any other questions right off the gates here, Janet, or should I just kind of jump into the next section?
I think we can go ahead. Let's keep moving along.
All right. All right, so we're going to talk now about the power of an email newsletter. So one thing I want to highlight here first is this was some research done by Agency Analytics on the top challenges facing marketing agencies. And as you can see, the #1 challenge here was that client acquisition, and almost by a 2-to-1 margin. So it bodes the question, why is client acquisition so hard for agencies? And if you're a consultancy, I've seen the numbers, they're very similar. And one of the big reasons for this challenge is the amount of competition. This is all numbers from IBISWorld, and they report that there are 90,000 plus advertising agencies in the US and a staggering 1.3 million consulting companies in the United States. So with that number, just imagine how competitive it must be. Imagine the inboxes and the phones of your prospects, and how it's so challenging to be different, because there's only so many ways you can do certain things. So that's one of the key reasons why it's so challenging. Yet what we see time and time again are agencies and consultancies, despite all this competition, still relying on word of mouth, their work, and awards to try to drive their growth. But as we talked about, the market is more competitive than ever. Those numbers are going up, they're not going down. And also the way buyers are making purchasing decisions really has changed fundamentally. And therefore, it's our belief to land these 6- and 7-figure opportunities and drive predictable growth, firms need to shift their mindset and their approach. And we have a methodology here that we call relationship making. We recognize with agencies and consultancies, it is a relationship type of business, but you can't rely only on your old relationships. You need a way to build, engage, and nurture new relationships And this is a process in our philosophy for that. And that process really is three parts. One part of it is, how do you build awareness for your firm and demand for its services in that competitive environment? And the email newsletter that we're going to be talking about today is one way to do that. The second part of relationship making is really, how are you going to engage those contacts? You can't necessarily just wait back and hope for them to contact you, even with a great, newsletter or other great, brand building, tactics. So you have to have a way to get in front of them more directly. And that's a lot of the work that we do with more outbound lead generation, which is a whole separate topic. And then the third part is, how do you nurture? We know when you're talking enterprise level sales, this is not a one call close type of business. There could be sales cycles of 3, 6, 12, 24, if not longer months for some of these deals. The bigger the deal, the longer the sales cycle. So you've done all this great work to build awareness. You've maybe even engaged them and you've met with them, but they're not ready to buy right now. How do you keep them? How do you nurture them over time and stay top of mind so when they are ready, they reach out to you? And that's where the newsletter can come in and really serve that dual purpose of building awareness and nurturing those prospects for you. So one of the key ways that is overlooked for a brand to differentiate ourselves, a B2B brand, is your brand. And there's research done by Boston Consulting Group and Google that found that 95% say that brand marketing can, in fact, help a company differentiate from its competitors. 97% say that brand marketing plays an important role in creating awareness and consideration. So those are staggering numbers. However, there's only 25% of B2B companies are devoting 20% or less of their marketing budget to brand. And we know from talking to agencies, consultancies, they're usually underinvesting in sales and marketing to begin with. So then you take, they're underinvesting and only spending, 20% of that basically leaves next to nothing for building brand. Yet we see and know from this research here that it can be such a very key component to differentiating yourself. So how do you differentiate yourself? And what we believe is that B2B companies need to be thinking of themselves as a brand publisher. And we've started to shift and adopt this point of view for ourselves as well. So thinking of ourselves and activating a marketing strategy that really aims to inform, educate, and engage audiences through your content on your own platforms and your own channels. So that's what we feel is a missed opportunity for B2B brands, is to be thinking from that type of mindset. One of the more famous examples of a company acting like a brand publisher is Red Bull. I'm sure most of us have seen and heard about Felix Baumgartner. He, jumped from space. It is all done through Red Bull. And, Red Bull has Red Bull Music Academy. They have, bike races, extreme sports. They have a number of different initiatives. I actually remember in the concert promotion days, I had a meeting at Red Bull's offices. And one of the first things they told me was, Christian, we are not an energy drink company. And at the time I was like, what do you mean? Of course you are. They're like, no, we are a media company that happens to sell Red Bull. And that always stuck with me. And that's kind of the mindset that we're trying to take here, is that, Christian Pinnock is a media company that happens to offer newsletter services, happens to offer lead generation services. And, at the end of the day, think of ourselves, again, more as a brand publisher. Now, that said, I'm not, advocating here and trying to tell everybody you need to have people jump from outer space to, get your agency or consultancy known. I'm suggesting here that an email newsletter is that first step to becoming a brand publisher. And you might be thinking, most of you, it looks like, have a newsletter, but there's a lot of people still thinking that, aren't email newsletters a relic of the past? And the fact is, if you follow the space, email newsletters are red hot right now. The Hustle, if you're familiar with them, HubSpot recently bought them for $27 million. Industry Dive was bought by Informa recently for $525 million. These are newsletter businesses that are getting gobbled up for millions and millions of dollars. So there's obviously something going on with newsletters if these types of activities are happening. Now, when we're talking about a newsletter, I want to be clear, we are not talking about the traditional company newsletter. And maybe this sounds like your newsletter, but we're not talking about an email that goes out about the new executive that was hired, the award you just won, your new client that you got, your 5-year anniversary. This is not what we're talking about in email newsletter. This, yes, this information is important, but that is internal information and maybe an internal type of newsletter. But I could tell you, your prospects don't care about these things. They are not looking and care about the award you just won, or, the new intern, and what school they're going to. This is not the type of content they're looking for. What they want is they want thought leadership. And there's research here done by LinkedIn and Edelman that show that 7 in 10 decision makers say that organizations, that they're more likely to think positively about organizations that consistently produce high quality thought leadership. 73% of decision makers said that thought leadership content offers more reliable gauge of somebody's capabilities than their own marketing materials and product descriptions. So this is what they want to hear about. They don't want to hear about your company updates. They want to hear about thought leadership. So they want to know about industry insights. They want to know how-to guides. They want expert interviews. They want to know about job changes happening in the industry. They want, resources to help them do their job better. So at the end of the day, you got to ask yourself, if you have a newsletter, you're thinking about one, how will it help your reader improve their job performance? That's one of the key takeaways that I want you to think about, as you walk away from this webinar. So what are the benefits then of a thought leadership newsletter? Well, we talked a little bit about these already, but it's creating that brand awareness. If you're doing outbound, which you should be, amplifying that and nurturing those relationships. Those are the 3 primary benefits. But there are a number of other secondary benefits. One of them is the ownership factor. Social media is great, but if you're doing a social strategy, you're on rented land. They can change the algorithms at any given time, and they do. So you've done all this work to, build up your social following, but there's no guarantee that's even going to make it, to the feed of your audience. Versus email, you have a direct way to stay in connection with your audience. There's the educational edge. And what I mean by that is, you can educate your audience, take them through the different stages of the buyer journey and give them your point of view on how to solve certain problems. So there is a way to kind of influence them and bring them into your line of thinking. There's the whole thing about traffic. You can use your newsletter to drive traffic to your website, to your blog, to your podcast, to your social channels. Authority building. By becoming the newsletter about X, you are now going to be seen as the authority on X after a given period of time. So when X comes up as something that they need help with, they're going to think about you. Your newsletter can be monetization. That could be in the form of leads that you get from it, business that you win from it, but you can also be thinking about your newsletters, possibly something that you sell advertising to. And that's something that we are starting to do, is bring on advertisers that want to get in front of our audience. And that's going to help us offset some of the cost of some of the new content that we are coming out with. There's the whole idea of networking through your newsletter. You can reach out to decision makers, influencers, partners, and you can offer them either to interview them for your newsletter. You can, offer guest posts, but it allows you to reach out to people and start a connection with them without selling them or pitching them on anything. This is something that we did very successfully last summer, where we had a whole program where we reached out to chief marketing officers, and we weren't sure how it was going to go over, but we actually had more CMOs that I could actually handle even interviewing. So we've actually pulled back that program, and we're in the process of revising it, based on what we learned in that kind of trial. So it's another great way to network. And the last part is values alignment. By, your content and your values coming through in that content in the newsletter, you're going to attract other people that have that same type of values. And I've seen it with our newsletter as well. I have a Monday motivation post that I do, and I'm sure not everybody on there enjoys that and likes that, and that might be not their cup of tea, but I do know that there's a percentage of the readers that really do. And every week I get emails from people saying how this resonated with them, and they're telling me stories about, their family and this and that. And it's been great. It's been a great way for me to, share my values and find other people that are like-minded. So I want to do another quick poll here, Janet. So this one is really around, what is your biggest email newsletter challenge? So this could be, if you already have a newsletter, what is the challenge you're facing? Or maybe if you don't have one yet, but you maybe think that this is going to be, your biggest challenge. And I want to make sure that, we touch upon, this throughout the presentation here. So I'll come back to that. Janet, any questions for me to address right now, or should we hold those off as well?
Well, this is, more for, I think, people are all been interested to know whether or not they'll get the deck, if they have an opportunity to get the webinar in recorded. And will that include some links or any PDFs of some of the research that you've mentioned in here as well?
I can, yeah, I'll link to all that. I didn't think about that, but yeah, that's a great idea. I'll include all of that. So thank you for those questions.
Yep.
All right, so then let's move on to the how part of this, how we think about newsletters. And we have a process that we've developed here that we call AWARE. And it's an acronym, and each letter stands for something as part of the process. And we're going to go over each one of these, but high level, to set some context, the first part is address a challenge. So what is the purpose of the newsletter? How will it help the reader improve their job performance? That's the first part. The second part is the W, widen the audience. So how do you identify the target audience and build prospect lists to expand the newsletter's reach? The second A is assemble content. How do you craft original, curated, or repurposed content? How do you decide on the depth, format, and audience needs of the content? The R is render the design. So design the templates, the sections, come up with a name, and align with your own brand guidelines. And number 5 would be E for evaluate performance, tracking engagement, growth, monetization, and feedback, and then optimizing that based on KPIs. So let's get into the first part here, which is address a challenge. So ultimately, you want to start asking yourself, what are the goals of the newsletter? I feel like a lot of firms have a newsletter because they think they should have a newsletter, but they haven't really defined what the goal of that newsletter is. So some of the common goals could be increasing brand awareness, driving traffic, generating leads and sales, engaging, maybe retaining your current clients, establishing authority and credibility. Maybe you do events, gathering feedback. So all of these are possible goals. I think it's challenging to probably check all the boxes with your newsletter. So you may have, 1 or 2 primary goals and maybe a couple secondary goals. But you need to get really clear on what those goals are, because the content and the design and everything is going to be hinged upon your ultimate goal. The next part is, what pain point or challenge does the target audience face in their daily work that your newsletter can address? And there's a couple different buckets to think about. From an education standpoint, are they coming to you because they want to be informed? Do they want to be the first to know? Are you going to break news? Are you going to go deep and give them expert analysis? Are you just going to explain the basics? Are you going to go over trends? Are you going to go deep? So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach the education part. And some of that's going to happen depending on your resources and your own capabilities. But there are also other things besides the education. They might want to feel a sense of connection. Maybe there's a part of a community that they feel is part of being in your newsletter, a belonging. Maybe there's a specific action they're or feeling that they're supposed to get. Maybe there's some action that they want to take. They're trying to do something new. They want to get involved. They want to create some sort of impact. Or maybe they're coming to you for entertainment, a break from the routine, relieving stress. We'll show a couple examples of some that are more entertainment focused. And likely they're coming for a variety of reasons. So you may want to think about a few of these, in terms of your newsletter. You also want to think about what unique insights or perspectives you can offer that aren't available in other newsletters. So it is key that you do take an audit, if you will, of the competitive set. Who are your competitors, direct, indirect, and what can you offer different? So is it your expertise? Do you have case studies and success stories? Do you have proprietary data? Are there innovative processes you have? Maybe it's tapping into your talent that you have at your firm. Are there partnerships and collaborations you can use in this? Do you have a unique company culture or values? So all of this is, again, something you're going to think about so you can give your newsletter a unique spin, and it's not just the same newsletter that everybody else is producing. Part of this process here is also understanding, are you going to be a newsletter that's focused on an industry? Are you going to talk, for example, maybe your firm has a lot of expertise in automotive. Is this going to be an automotive industry newsletter? Or perhaps your newsletter is going to be more persona-based, meaning, maybe your newsletter is going to be for chief marketing officers, and there's pros and cons to all this, right? If you do an industry-based newsletter, the pro is that you can go really deep into specific industry and show your expertise. The con is, what if you work across multiple industries? Then that newsletter may not be relevant to anybody else besides in, for example, the automotive industry. Persona-based, again, it could be very relevant to anybody in a CMO position. So it's kind of cross-industry, which is, an advantage. But maybe that's not a good thing too. Maybe the CMO of a large consumer packaged good company is going to want different types of content than a CMO of a small B2B type of company. So you do run the risk of the content not being as relevant. Or maybe it's service-based. Maybe you're a digital marketing agency and your newsletter is going to be about digital marketing. Well, then that is really kind of industry agnostic. It could be persona agnostic. So you really can cast a wide net with it. But again, is it going to be too general of information? Are your prospects going to want something that's more focused on their industry or focused on their specific discipline within digital marketing and their job function? So you may want to consider a combination, thereof, whether it be two, pieces of this or three. To give an example, so for our newsletter, right now we are targeting advertising and marketing agencies. Specifically, the people that we're looking for, the personas are those that are responsible for growth or leadership within those firms. And our service is business development. So we have all three of those that are combining together. And I think our content is really relevant to those that are in that particular role. But as we think about our own expansion, and we're working more and more now with consulting companies, that newsletter isn't going to be relevant to consulting companies. So we're now in the process of thinking through, how do we launch a second newsletter that's more specific to the consulting industry? And is there certain content that can be reused in both places? So there's, again, pros and cons to each, but it's something you want to consider before you launch your newsletter. A couple of other examples that are out there, that we can take inspiration from, the Daily Skim. So they succinctly break down the news, trends, policies, and politics that impact women so they can make confident decisions. So there's a little bit more persona-based with women. And then you have the Marketing Millennials. So they provide marketing tips and trends, but done for the young professional. And they are doing, again, more of a service-based marketing. It's not a specific area of marketing. And a persona is more of the young professional. And if you're familiar with their content, they talk a lot about some of the same things you might see in Ad Age or Ad Week, but they're doing it with memes and funny jokes and appealing, again, to a different audience. So you're going to want to think about, again, how can you put maybe a different spin on what's out there that's going to be relevant to, your audience? And again, at the end of the day, so I want to come back to is, how will your newsletter help your reader improve their job performance? So the next part is widen the audience. And I saw on the poll here that this was a topic that people wanted some information about. So I think we'll provide some answers here. So one of the three kind of steps to this is creating an ideal company profile, a buyer persona, and then building the list. So what I mean by ideal company profile is you want to really think about, who are your best customers that you have, your best clients and your firm? What industries are they in? Where are they located? What are the size of those organizations? What development stage? Are these startups? Are these mature companies? What other maybe notable attributes do these companies have? So just like you're thinking about this, hopefully from a new business perspective on who you would potentially target for new business, you want to think through your newsletter through that same type of lens. So once you've built out this ideal company profile, then you can move on to creating a buyer persona. So the buyer persona is who within the organizations do you want to have on your newsletter? And similarly, it should be probably decision makers and influencers that could potentially do business with your organization. So there needs to be that connective tissue. Does it make sense to have a newsletter that's targeting industries or people that aren't in your set of potential customers? So here we're talking about, what are the right job titles? What is the seniority level? What is their experience? Where are they located? But you're going to want to go through this type of process to identify who those individuals are that you're trying to attract to your newsletter. So once you have that figured out, the first step I would actually do before we get to the next one is look internally to what you have already. I call them the friendly contacts. who are the alumni, current clients, employees, influencer investors, media, so on and so forth. Who do you already know that, would this newsletter would be relevant to them? And the newsletter may not be relevant to them. If you're writing an automotive, newsletter for digital marketers, and your other people that your contacts aren't on that, they might not find the newsletter relevant, and that's fine. But it doesn't mean don't go through this process and try to identify who would potentially be somebody that you want to stay in front of. But the key to all of this here is really, how are you going to expand that list? And what was interesting is that when we went through this process, I went to a lot of our past contacts and I went to their websites to determine if they even have a newsletter. And when I followed up with different contacts, some of them who did have a newsletter, I would, acknowledge that. Those that did not have a newsletter, I would acknowledge that. And I got a number of people that, from what I saw online, did not have a newsletter. There's no way to even subscribe for the newsletter online. And I found some of them replied back and said, hey, we do have a newsletter. And in most cases, I went back to the website and there was no way to sign up. So I'm not sure what the goal of the newsletter is, if that's just an internal thing or what, but it was surprising to me that you were not allowing prospects to register and become a part of your newsletter on your website. And then in some other cases, I did find the subscription button, but it was buried within the website. And if I have to go there and search and I can't even figure out, you can be certain that your prospects, can't, figure out how to subscribe to it either. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. But beyond that, what's key here is that once you've developed your buyer persona and your ideal company profile, you can use tools like LinkedIn, ZoomInfo, Apollo, and Crunchbase. And within a matter of minutes, you can build out a contact list of companies and prospects that fit your profile. And what you can do then is you can take those contacts and you could put them into your email list. And no different than if you were to do kind of a cold outreach type program and send emails to them, you can do that through a newsletter. And there's a big misconception that, that is, something illegal or maybe violates some sort of rules. And the fact is that it doesn't. Under the CAN-SPAM Act in the US, you do not need prior consent to send business-to-business emails. So it's perfectly legal to go ahead and download the list of your contacts and put them in your newsletter. So that is, if you're struggling with your subscribers, this is the #1 key on how you can build your exact list of people that you want, to target onto your newsletter. Now, that said, there are certain rules that you need to comply by, but none of this is something that I would imagine you would do anyways. It's things like don't use false or misleading header information, which basically means if I'm sending an email from Christian@christianbinock.com, it has to say Christian@christianbinock.com. Don't make up a fake name. You can't use deceptive subject lines. You can't identify them. You have to identify the message as an ad. You got to put your address in the newsletter. You have to have an opt-out. So these are all very basic, normal things that any email service provider like a MailChimp, already provide, off the shelf. So that's something that, people are often, not aware of. And you may also be thinking about, well, do they want to get my newsletter? Are they going to mark me as spam? Are they going to unsubscribe to the list? And, our experience has been that if you're providing a traditional newsletter that's all about you, you do run the risk of that because they don't want that information. Nobody wants that information. But if you provide a value-driven thought leadership newsletter that is relevant to them, you're going to be shocked at how many of them stay on the newsletter and want to receive that newsletter on a week-to-week basis. So that has been a big unlock for us over the years, is figuring that out. So a couple, brief things here. So in terms of different types of newsletters, so Industry Dive, as I mentioned, there's, these 3 different personas. They have Automotive Dive, which is more of an industry-based newsletter. They have CFO Dive, which is more persona-based, and they have Social Media Today, which is a more service-based newsletter. So again, there's a couple different ways to think about it, or again, maybe you want to marry those all together. Janet, you got a question? I think you're muted.
Yeah, we had one question around the list, so I thought that might be a good time to bring it up. Somebody asked, what about segmenting the list? And you have everyone on the list, and then some emails will get industry information when you do an industry, and some would get persona. Hopefully I did capture that correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one way to do it. Obviously, there's a little more work on your behalf to make sure that you have the list segmented and have content that's relevant for each of them. But yeah, that's if you have the resources to do that, that's absolutely some way to do it. And I would encourage it. Yeah, good question. So the next part here is assemble content. And so what you want to start thinking about as well is the sections of your newsletter. What type of content are you going to provide? Because there's a lot of different types of content. I think by default, a lot of agencies and consultancies only think about content as this sort of long form, thought leadership, research-based type of content, when the reality is there's a lot of different types of content you can have. You can have case studies, you can have how-to guides, you could do interviews, you could have humorous memes and other sorts of humor in there. You could, yes, do industry insights and trends. You could talk about job changes, job listings, personal anecdotes, like I write the Monday Motivation. You could do Q&A, you can do reader polls. So there's a lot of different types of content. It's not just about, that kind of long form, thought leadership type of piece. But yes, what you do want to think about, do you want to do a more deep dive type of newsletter? It's a little bit bigger lift for your team to consistently write that type of content, but it will get shared more often than, say, curated content will. You can also do briefs. So maybe that is a short story or summary. Maybe you put your point of view on why this is relevant or why this is important. Maybe you have three to five of those in your newsletter. And those are easily consumed and a lot easier for you to create versus the long form. You can also do bullets, which is basically just a quick news summary written in your tone of voice with maybe a one-sentence description of what's happening. Usually these are around, extraordinary images, facts, tips, those sort of things. So these are even easier, to create. And maybe you want a combination. Most newsletters, I actually think, have some combination. Maybe they have a deep dive once a month, or they have a, short summaries with some bullets. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. But again, I just want to get you thinking, beyond just that one long form type of newsletter. You do want to think about content types. Are you going to be a newsletter that is all original content or partially original content, meaning you are creating it, from scratch? This is your thinking. And that's great. However, there are other ways to slice this as well, especially if you're limited in resources, limited in budget. You can curate content, meaning that you can share valuable external content from articles, reports, industry news, and that can be very valuable. I want everyone also to, think about that. Some of those newsletters that I said that were getting bought for all this money, like not all of them even are creating, original content. A lot of them are just curating content, but they've become the go-to source for busy executives who don't have time to track down 50 different resources. They bring it all together into one place. And actually, we'll show you a little bit about our newsletter, and ours is primarily a curated newsletter. And then repurpose content. What do you have already that's out there? Blogs, white papers, reports, maybe pitch decks, things like that that you could repurpose and put into your newsletter. So you could really use, all of these three, or just focus just on one. When we're talking about original content, the way we work with clients is to really have them think about your prospect, your audience, the awareness stage, consideration, decision-making stage. What are their questions, problems, and objections that they have at each one of the different phases, and to start to think about the type of content that might be relevant to them. Generally, you're probably focusing more on awareness and consideration type of content for your newsletter. If you're doing the curated content, what are the podcasts, social influencers, trade association events, webinars, and so on that your target audience is following already? And how, again, do you become the aggregator of all of that information and put it into one place? And then the third part is, repurpose content. So doing a content audit. What do you have already? And then assessing what is, it would be potentially useful for your newsletter. You might also be thinking about, well, Christian, am I really going to just send out emails that are all education-based and not talk about ourselves? And the answer is no, you don't have to do that. My suggestion would be to not exceed more than 20% of the newsletter's content as promotional. I would definitely keep it at 80% educational, if not more than that. I think for us, Last couple of weeks been promoting this webinar, so we've had probably 20% promotional, but probably next week we're going to be back to just the educational, it'll be 100% education. So it doesn't have to be all education. You build trust by education, then you could weave in the promotional here or there. Let's see how are we doing on time here. Yeah, I'll do a quick just walkthrough of our newsletter. I know some people are familiar with it, but just a kind of quick overview here. So what you'll see in our newsletter is, we'll start off with a, introduction paragraph that I write along with some bullets, which more or less are a table of contents for the newsletter, what you can expect in this edition to hopefully grab them. Then I get into this Monday motivation that I've spoken about. So this is something that I write. Usually it's every Sunday night, and this goes out Monday. So it's a little stressful at times creating it, but I get it out every week. And then there is a quote that I'll include there as well. So that's kind of how we started off. And it's Monday morning, this goes out. And then we have, I talked a little bit about humor. We have an agreement with Adweek, which some of you may be familiar with, but they are a funny tweets and LinkedIn post. And I just reached out to them a couple years back and said, hey, I love your account. Would you mind if I, included you in our newsletter, and you're going to get exposure to our audience? And they said, yes. There's no money exchanged. We help promote them, through our newsletter, and they help give us content on a week-to-week basis. So that's another thing to think about. What are some partners or collaborations that you could do that doesn't have to cost you any money to get content? Then we have our CM on the moves. This is what I would call curated content. We have a team that's actually offshore that tracks the CMOs every week. They produce a list. I get that list on Saturday mornings. I select the top 5 that I think are most interesting, and it goes into the newsletter. So again, another way to think about it, you don't have to do all this work. There are certain tasks that could be maybe outsourced to even offshore type of talent. This is a recent newsletter. So we were promoting this particular webinar here. So that's the 20% of promotional content. We have this RFP section that we've started within the last few months. So similarly, I consider this curated content. We subscribe to a number of different RFP services. We have, again, an offshore team that is managing and looking through them, trying to identify what are the most interesting ones. I get a list of 3, 4, 5 different RFPs, and then I select which one I think is the most interesting for the week. And then we have our quick hit section, which is kind of like the bullet section, which is typically 5 links to articles that we feel are relevant to our persona, those agency growth and agency leaders. So this is always kind of from a new business type of angle. And essentially what we do is we have subscriptions to maybe 50, and usually most of these are free subscriptions to 50 different resources, LinkedIn people we follow. And we have, again, someone on the team that goes through those and identifies the top, 5, and that gets into the newsletter. So another curation type of piece. And then we have our footer here in the bottom, which is a little bit about, who we are. So, hopefully that's a little bit helpful to kind of dissect, each one of the different sections that you might be thinking about for your newsletter.
Got a couple.
Question? Sure.
Questions on content. So one of them is, with original content, what do you think about keeping everything in the email, in the newsletter, versus just doing previews and linking to that website or a Substack, whatever is that original source?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what I've seen as far as that goes is that if you can keep them in the email, that is generally a better practice versus then asking them to click out someplace else. So if that content is original and you really want them to read it, I would keep it inside of the email versus linking out elsewhere. But you're also going to have to think about your newsletter. If you have a lot of different sections in there, it could become really long. So you might want to figure out a balance. But if that content is really important, I would just put it in the email itself.
Great. One more.
Yep.
Would you change the strategy for content if the product you're selling is a higher price point and you only wanted to target like very top decision makers? Does that influence the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would. I think it all boils down to, again, knowing your audience and what type of content is relevant, for them. Actually, I removed this slide from here because we're going to probably be short on time, but, how big should the list be is something that you might be asking yourself. And I think it depends. Like if you're talking multi-million-dollar engagements, you know, a few hundred people, but if they're the right people, might be the right list size for you. If you're, you know, smaller deal sizes, then maybe you need, you know, more into thousands. So I think it really depends on your audience and the deal size.
Great, thanks.
Sure. All right, so let's move into render the design. So why is design important? Well, you know, it's going to help you punch above your weight. You're going to look smarter, more professional. Great design is easier to read, which is going to increase your open and click-through rates and help them come back time and time again. And it's going to help you stand out. Most newsletters, I would say, are very ugly. And so the bar is really low on this. That said, I wouldn't overthink design either. You know, if I had to say, do I want a newsletter with great design and poor content, or great design and or the opposite? You know, I would absolutely go with great content and poor design. Now, a lot of I know on here are agencies, so I think the design piece is going to be important and should be important, but I wouldn't overthink it too much. I would focus more so on the content and be more focused on that. But that said, you know, part of the thing with the newsletter is you're going to think about the name of the newsletter. You obviously want it to be catchy and creative, something memorable. You want to focus on keywords. You want it to align with your brand. So some of the, you know, names that I particularly like, Morning Brew. I mean, you could already visualize somebody with their cup of coffee reading it in the morning. Daily Dispatch. This is one I came across that is in the fire industry, and it's a daily news, a daily publication about the fire industry. I'd never read it myself, but I love the name. It makes a lot of sense. So think about what your name would be. You're going to want to develop a template. This is critical here when it comes from a design standpoint. One, it's going to be make sure you're consistent with your brand. Two, it's going to make the efficiency and time saving. You can't reinvent the wheel every week or every other week, however often you're publishing, with creating something new. You need a template that it's just drag and drop the content in. Otherwise, it's going to take way too much time. So you have to think a little bit in the future about what type of sections you may want, and you build that template accordingly. So it's very modular. You could just drag and drop. And then it's also great for analytics and optimization. You could see week over week certain sections, you know, what's getting engagement, what's getting clicked, what's not, and then you could change and swap things out accordingly. And then some of the design best practices that are out there, you know, as I mentioned, you know, answering the last question, you know your audience, leverage your brand identity and personality. You want that to come through in the newsletter. You want that hierarchy, visual hierarchy. You want to make it skimmable, right? You don't want a big long block of text, you know, so you want to have sections, headers, dividers, boxes. Try to use shorter paragraphs, use bullets, incorporate visual elements into it, and then also make sure it's mobile friendly, because most people, let's be honest, are probably going to consume it on their mobile device. So the last part here is evaluate performance. And we think about performance in 4 areas: engagement, growth, monetization, and feedback. So from an engagement standpoint, this is kind of the typical metrics that you probably think about: open rates, click rates, unsubscribe, spam, bounce rates. And you could see there some of the benchmarks that you should be shooting for with your newsletter. So you want 30% or more open rate. You want click rates or click on open rates to be 5 to 9%, low unsubscribes, and low spam and bounce. But beyond those typical metrics, you want to think about also your active list size. So some of the tools out there can show you, you know, what percentage of your audience is engaging in a newsletter more often. You want to also look at, ideally, yes, you do have a mechanism for people to subscribe to your newsletter organically as well. So how many people are coming to you daily, weekly, and monthly new subscribers? And that you'll see, if you have a great newsletter, people will refer you. Hey, sign up. We get those all the time from people. And then you're going to want to understand too, you know, what does it cost to build your list, whether that be organically or through, you know, the method that I showed earlier. And then you're also going to want to know from a monetization standpoint, if you are doing some sort of advertisers in there, what is the click rate for ads? Because that's what the advertisers care about, is clicks. What is the revenue you're generating from it? Then you're going to want to think through direct and indirect leads. And what I mean by that is direct leads these are people that just respond to your email newsletter and say, hey, we want to meet, or tell me more information, and then you end up meeting with them. Indirect leads would be somebody that maybe you reach out to on LinkedIn, or you reach out to via cold email, and you discover, you know, along the way that they're on your newsletter and they're familiar with you. And we get these all the time. You know, I'll connect with someone on LinkedIn and they'll say, hey, you know, thanks for the connection. I'm on your newsletter, love the content. I'd love to learn more about what you do. So that was what we'd call an indirect meeting. And I pulled some numbers yesterday just to highlight. And so since we started the business, we've had 389 discovery calls with new clients. 41 of those were directly from the newsletter. They literally just replied to the email, said we want to meet. Again, even though we don't have any call to action, we don't ask anybody, hey, do you want to meet in the newsletter? They just took it upon themselves. So that's almost more than 10%. And then more than half of the meetings we've had, in one way, shape, or form, we can track back to our newsletter influencing them to initially take that meeting with us. And then therefore, we can also track back over $2 million in one business that was either directly or indirectly coming from our newsletter. And then the last part here is feedback. So you can do things like NPS scores. There's something like good, better, best that happen in newsletters. So you might want to get a sense of like what readers are thinking of your newsletter. And especially if you're introducing new types of content, you can see how that affects it. You could do surveys. Last summer, we did a survey to our subscribers and asked them for a number of different things, but part of it was like, what type of content are they looking for? And then you're also going to see direct replies. People will just reply to the newsletter and, give you some sort of feedback. Could be positive, could be negative, but I love the positive ones where people write back and, you can start a conversation with them. And I've actually started some business relationships, from the newsletter. So that's been a great byproduct of it. So that's the main content here. I do want to think, as you digest all of this content. Yep, do you have a question, Janet?
Nope. Well, I don't know if you want to share that last poll. We never did.
Oh yeah, let's talk about that poll. So what was the...
So we wanted to ask about, again, the biggest email newsletter challenge.
Yep. So it looks like growing a subscriber list was in fact the number one. Number 2 and 3 were tied, which was engaging content and a consistent schedule, which I think are similar. So hopefully, yeah, when we could talk, I think unpack maybe some of these more in the Q&A that, we'll have a few minutes here. But I want to talk about the path forward for everybody here. And I want to share here that anybody that's on this webinar, if you're looking, whether that you have a newsletter already and you're just looking to get more out of it, or you don't have a newsletter and you want to think about it, I know we'll have a few minutes for Q&A, but if you want to spend some time with us, we're happy to set up a strategy session. We can go over your newsletter goals, audience identification and list building, which I know is a hot topic, your content strategy, design, or even the performance metrics. So just send me an email, Christian@ChristianBinnock. Happy to set that up. And I also want to make everybody aware that we do offer this as a done-for-you service. So if you are looking for someone just to come in and take over your newsletter, we have the capabilities to do that. We have plans where we would, come in and we would do a monthly newsletter, and that's everything from the strategy, the design, the content, the reporting, and that's $2,000 a month. We have a biweekly version for $3,500, and then we have a monthly version a weekly version that would be $5,000 per month. So happy to talk to anybody, about that if that is of interest. But yeah, that wraps up the content completely now. So let's jump into some of the Q&A.
Great. We do have a couple more questions that I haven't been able to ask along the way.
Sure.
One of the attendees asked, I know this may depend on audience or industry, but any recommendations on cadence?
Yes, I do have a recommendation on cadence. Ideally, you're shooting for a weekly newsletter. And the reason behind it is you want to stay top of mind with them. You want to become a habit. I feel like our newsletter, for example, we become a habit for our loyal subscribers that they know every Monday at 9 a.m. they're going to get our newsletter. And you want to become part of their habit. If you're sending it out monthly or even worse, longer than that, you're not going to become a habit. By the time they get that next email from you, they're going to forget that you even existed. So I think a happy medium as you're starting off is maybe bi-weekly, but I really would try to strive to do a weekly type of newsletter.
Sounds good. Another question is there a platform that you find agencies use most or prefer? And this person mentioned, i.e. like a HubSpot.
I can tell you from our work in the newsletter space, the primary, there's a couple of different tools. There's a new tool that's pretty fresh on the market called Beehive. that is built specifically for newsletters. It was built by actually people that were a part of Morning Brew that had left. They were part of its rapid growth and they left and they formed it. So there is a lot of features that are just newsletter specific versus like a HubSpot or even a MailChimp. And we do use MailChimp, but even a MailChimp, they've branched out now and done so many different things. I think they've lost focus on what their core was, which was email newsletters, because they're trying to do too many things. And I think HubSpot's probably in the same bucket. Not that all these tools can probably do the same thing, but I would, if you're looking at other alternatives, I would look into Beehive.
Great. So what would be if your recommendation on what resources would you say a company needs in-house in order to be able to create and publish a newsletter?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of it's going to depend on the type of newsletter that you ultimately decide to go with. If you're going to be doing more of the deep dive in expert analysis, then I think it's leveraging your subject matter experts to produce content. And again, I mean, if you're looking at a weekly or biweekly, I mean, you could spread that out, over time. So I think it's having some of that if you're doing more of the deep dive. If you're, I think I think one of the successes that we've had is the personalized approach that we've taken with our newsletter. I think we've had success with. So weaving in something from your founder or owner or some other, key figure, I think will help, could help as well. So I think access to them and having their input and in it would also be helpful. And then I think also, as we talked about some of the curated content, that could be, everything from interns to junior staff, or even outsourcing it to, other people, I think could also be a viable channel, especially for like the curated and maybe repurposed type of content.
Okay, great. I think I have one last question, unless anybody fires it up. Any overall response on, is curated or original content going to make a bigger difference in, let's say, overall results in engagement and subscriptions?
Yeah, I think again, I hate to say it, but it depends. If you're serving a specific niche, and there's a lot of different content out there, and these are busy executives, and you can take the content that's most relevant to them and put it in one spot that they can get it, whatever it is, once a week, and it's 5 minutes, and this is everything that they need to know for the week to get their job done better. That could be very powerful, whether it's, original or curated content. But if your goal is to, be more thought leadership driven of your own thought leadership, then maybe you want, you want the longer form. But I don't know if there's really a right or wrong answer, even just taking yourself out of the B2B newsletter space. I mean, there's newsletters that are strictly curated, and have grown to be millions of subscribers. And there are some that have original content that have grown to be that. So I don't think there's a right answer.
Wonderful. Well, I think it's top of the hour by almost to 1 minute. I don't see any more questions.
Awesome.
So I think we are at the end.
Very good. Well, I appreciate everybody for the time, the great questions. We will be sending this off maybe tomorrow or Friday. And again, if there are anybody that would like to, hop on that strategy call, we're happy to set that up and talk strategy with you about your newsletter. So thank you.